So that actually leads to something else. These are mainly HIV diaries. Susan's been doing this work for a very long time. It's fantastic. Like if she gives you some stuff, you should read them. But I wanted to see more kind of deliberations of like public good, public good decisions, right? A lot of these were personal kind of injustices kinds of things, etc. Where, even the one discussion where should this man be allowed into the cooperative, it was like a kind of like a one-off case. It wasn't really bringing into the village goods and then how should we deliberate about that, etc. I'm going to come to that in a minute. So for example, you have an example of this kind of decentralization and kind of how these CBOs have now been beaten down into like this pattern of, I can only write a proposal this way, and then I have to have a director and a board of whatever, et cetera, et cetera. But if you think about it, what should the NAC, the National AIDS Commission, let's say, do? Right? If you really say, I'm going to have a decentralized program where the unit of decentralization are these villages, which there are thousands of, you can't just let everybody send in their handwritten proposals, right? It's like, so the dilemma really in decentralization is kind of how to have a workable system, right, without restraining the potential beneficiaries too much, right? So in some sense, I don't see that kind of being beaten down into fine. Social funds have menus exactly for this reason. And then maybe the menu includes a football field or not. That's a discussion, but that's at the margin. So as economists, we like to call this extensive versus intensive margin. I think actually there's nothing much wrong with what you're writing there. It's just that on the margin, is this thing becoming just too restrictive that any pretense of this being decentralized or deliberative or demand-driven is lost at the end of it. The modern formal setting reminded me very much of where another country I work in, neighboring Tanzania, where social funds meetings, we go to the villages, and then what you find is kind of, think of that table over there is the kind of elders and the people from Dar es Salaam who came, who are explaining the project. And then here are all the villagers sitting under the tree. And then they're just talking about a bunch of acronyms that nobody understands. People are nodding off over here. And then they're just kind of telling people what's going to happen. And then the next day, the village chief calls in people to say, okay, you guys are going to run a chicken business. You guys are going to, this is how the money is going to come in. But then I've also seen examples where there were literally written down matrices of like 10 by 10 things. Each cell had been debated and voted on. And then through this process, they had actually come down to a cell saying this village is going to get this thing. Right? So in some sense, those deliberations happen, but in a lot of cases, it is really true that in the end, it's kind of this inner circle making all the decisions. Now, I want to bring up an issue of measurement. I don't know how much time I have left. 5 minutes, maybe? Thank you. So I struggled with this a little bit because I know about these journals a little, and some of these people have been working with Susan presumably for a very long time. Like some journalists could be a decade, right? And I always envision these as you're literally sitting under the village tree, and then you hear a conversation and you jot it down. You're on the bus, you jot it down, etc. You're at the bar, you're hearing these conversations about sex and etc. Those are all great to me, but then these inner circle cases, they made me a little uncomfortable because now I'm a journalist, but I'm part of the story, right? So, and then it's just like immediately my mind went to like Anderson Cooper in Haiti with like the baby, he's rushing the baby to Sanjay Gupta, right? There is no way that story is going to end any differently than what CNN shows you, right? There's no way that like we're gonna see Anderson Cooper drop the baby and run over to this other story that is more exciting, right? Because it make him look really bad. So you have now these journalists, and I know you're a very big skeptic on self-reported data, right? I actually learned this from you and Bijo, et cetera. Now I'm a big skeptic, and I only want to collect direct observation data. I'm going to challenge that these journalists' accounts of like inner circle discussions are to be trusted, right? I don't know, but it doesn't come out in the paper at all that this is a source of data that's kind of different than the rest of the paper. Right? And I think that's a really important point because this person who's telling this story from my Western way of looking at things comes out as like on the right side of the story. Definitely not on the heartless side where like, oh, let's exclude the guy with sores on his body because he's HIV/AIDS. She's the one arguing, let's include him in, right? So I don't know what to make of that. Like, this is not an independent journalist. And that's the hard part. Like in Tanzania, we always say we want to have in these district meetings where these villages proposals are being selected, we want to be the fly on the wall, but it's impossible. We can't put a tape recorder in there, and if we ask people who are inside, they're all insiders, so we just gave up on figuring out how they make these decisions. So you're making a valiant attempt, but because you know these people so well, maybe you can give us some context about how we can interpret these data. A few minutes left. Yeah, I was like Varun a little bit on these kind of, there is, in many cases, there is this deliberation, and there is limited deliberation depending on the context, but the context itself seems completely unfair, to me at least. So there's the case of expelling students. I will tell you, I know Malawi, there's no rule that says you can throw out a kid out of school because they had sex. There's just absolutely not, right? You can't even throw out people because they're pregnant. Under Banda, it used to be the case that you could throw out, oh, thank you. You could throw out people for being pregnant, and it was actually very equitable. They also threw out the boy who got you pregnant. But nowadays, you can actually be pregnant, go to school, and then after you give birth, you can go back. So that seemed very unfair. They had no right to throw out these kids. Standard 8 is when you're taking your secondary school entry exams. This is the most important exam in these people's lives, right? It's just expelling somebody from a village. Like, what's up with that? Right?
The context there wasn't explicitly written. Push the button to what we presented. The students were staying specially in the school over Christmas holiday to study. So they had made that rule explicitly for that situation. So it's not a ministry rule.
Yeah. So still, though, like proportionality, as you mentioned, like for having sex as a teenager, you know, to miss the most important exam of your life seems really harsh. And then there's maybe I want to talk about this. I know a fair bit of Northerners in Malawi who live in the South and who are married to Southerners. One of the biggest examples in this, the longest examples in this book, is about this wife inheritance and how they grabbed, and then the court's ruling. I mean, you mentioned this, Varun, a little bit. It is really borders on absurd, because instead of saying, look, this woman is a human being, she has rights, she does not want to marry some guy because he's like the late husband's brother, they say chokolo, and they talk about all these HIV-related, and even, it's interesting to me, even the woman herself doesn't assert her right as a person to refuse to marry this guy and keep her property. You know, so these deliberations happen, but they're happening in this strange context of like very limited. And then I think to myself, why is a northern family being adjudicated in a southern customary law setting? This has to be dealt with in a national kind of, there has to be like a higher level of law. They're completely playing an away game. And I think you don't give the context here, but before these people were married, there had to have been very serious discussions at the individual family level. What will happen, right? Because one has bride price, one doesn't, right? So these are all. So my point from this simply is kind of that, you know, it wasn't so clear to me in the end that kind of when playing, you know, even though there's deliberation, the playing fields in these cases are not really level. So then what does it mean to deliberate in an unlevel playing field? And then, you know, gender issues come out really big, and then the centralized rule of law, and et cetera, et cetera. And final point, you referred to Paramita and Biju's paper, and then you kind of like one takeaway message you have is that there may be serious constraints in a setting like Malawi to introduce that kind of like deliberative, you know, context because of Malawians, you know, respect for kind of education, and then also the status and hierarchy that comes with that. And I think that's, maybe you were trying to be provocative, but, you know, I'm just not sure. To me, that's just a statement. I mean, if you know these two wonderful women, I have lunch with them, etc. They always have really strong feelings about something. You're talking about them, they say, oh, no, that's wrong, right? But, you know, and that's useful, but I think I think that we should try, right? We should try out. You know, I don't think your paper says that there are these big barriers. I think without trying, we can't know. And I really like Dr. Mackey's suggestion, you know. It's testable whether dancing and singing, you know, before and after does something different than not. So maybe instead of just taking your word for it respectfully, maybe let's go try something and see if it actually, there are big barriers or not. So sorry to go over my time, but yeah.